Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we are covering the first half of Augustine's City of God, his critique of pagan Rome. Love is the central feature of all the writings of Saint Augustine. All humans, irrespective of their state of grace, Augustine argued, desire to love and be loved. The role of love has a direct impact upon the political in Augustine's political theology, since humans are political animals defined by their loves. What people love, Augustine reminds us, will become the aim of politics and society, the very movement of our being. And this, of course, can have disastrous consequences based on what we love. The city of man, founded on its love of self, inevitably exhausts itself into the lust for domination and an ethos of coercive domination in false hope to satisfy the self. The city of man, therefore, is that, quote, city which aims at domination, which holds nations in enslavement, but is itself dominated by the very lust of domination. The city of God, by contrast, rooted in its love of God, leads to cooperation and a hopeful restoration of the harmony that had been lost because of the fall. As he charts out the two cities in the city of God, it becomes clear that Augustine's theology is also the first systematic form of cultural critique aimed at exposing the empty ideology and propaganda of Alta Moenia Romae, the high walls of Rome. This should not be surprising. Many scholars also recognize the critical project engaged in Augustine's work. Ernest Fortin noted the aim of Augustine's critique of the pagan political project was to unmask its vices. Peter Brown, the great scholar of late antiquity, likewise argued that part of the City of God was written to critically examine the hypnotizing myth of Rome. In analyzing, deconstructing, and unmasking the vices of pagan Rome, Augustine's political theology is primarily one of critique, in which critique served as the foundation to draw contrasts with. Therefore, Augustine's political theology is also deeply dialectical. Augustine made known that the city of man was characterized by its love of self and desire to satisfy its own disordered passions. The city of man, quote, was created by love of self, reaching to the point of contempt of God. To understand the city of man, which all humans are transient citizens of, we must ask the question, quid sit homo? What is man? According to Christianity's doctrine of creation, which of course Augustine will follow, creatio ex nihilo, the proper understanding of humanity is that humanity ultimately came from nothing. Humanity is only truly human when clothed in grace, but the fall of man has stripped man of his grace, and he is now naked, as Augustine explained in the latter half of the City of God. In Genesis, when it describes Adam and Eve as naked, Augustine reads this to mean not a physical nakedness, but a naked of that original grace which was granted unto them in creation. Apart from God, naked of grace, man is nothing. Man is, to put it mildly, a domineering brute captured by lust, which is the negative privation of love. So here we must understand the distinction between love and lust in Augustine's anthropology and theology. Man, when united with God in Christ and in grace, is moved by the spirit of love. Stripped of grace and stripped of being united from God in Christ, loves negative reality is lust. So sinful man, rather than being a lover, is a luster. Lust is the negative reality of what emerges when one is privated of love. Those who have read the Confessions would know how this is very similar to Augustine's understanding of evil. Evil is a privation of the good. Lust is the privation of love. To love only the self is to love what you are apart from God, namely the naked and domineering brute who has no grace covering him, and therefore no love moving in him. Therefore the so-called love of self that is fostered in the city of man is the love of nothing, because it rejects enjoying God, and in the process rejects that self-emptying love and goodness which serves as the groundwork for the harmonious unity of humanity with each other and with creation prior to the fall. Following the Augustinian maxim of becoming what you love, it is also true that the political comes to promote what its citizenry desires. Culture and politics subsequently inculcate what its citizens love through its apparatuses, institutions, and other structural systems, creating a mass society united in either love or lust. Augustine's critique of Roman culture as promoting the love of nothingness comes out most poignantly in his cultural criticism of Roman power and institutional structures, which subsequently inculcated a habit of love of nothingness within him, which manifested itself through a negation of fully living in accord with the Imago Dei. Augustine recounted his time being formed by the conventions and institutions of Roman society, and remarks as to what kind of human Roman institutions and systems had made him. The educational apparatus of the late Western Roman Empire inculcated that love of self into Augustine. He would lie, cheat, and engage in flattery to win the praises of others who honored him as a role model, an exemplary student, as he explained in the Confessions. He stole from his parents to barter and come into possession of toys of his classmates. The rhetorician that he was, Augustine's command of speech was put to the service of slavery rather than truth, to get what he wanted and therefore control others in the process. His actions to win the praise of others was symptomatic of his self-love and self-seeking glory that Roman education instilled into him, and he also acknowledged that the educational system of which he was upheld as a sterling exemplar of led him astray from God. In reading Virgil's Aeneid and appreciating the deep beauty therein, Augustine learned to weep for Dido and her surrender to the sword, all the while he sank lower and lower in his own pit of despair. Jupiter, too, his teachers informed him, would punish the wicked, yet Jupiter constantly engaged in immoral acts himself. From this picture, Augustine understood that Roman education was shifting the blame of wickedness to the gods, or even to other human beings, freeing humans to engage in their base actions, which had already been willed by the gods anyway. Here, Augustine begins a long tradition in Christian theology that seeks to free God from evil. Evil is a product of human free will, and not God's decrees, as is implied in the Roman mythology and stories. In this way, the love of self and the self's desires to remain inward rather than serve others was justified through the texts and stories that he learned. Far from the humanistic education that Cicero advocated, of which Cicero identified moral collapse as the cause for the downfall of the Roman Republic and its transition into empire, Roman education extolled wickedness and self-centeredness as the highest goal for one to aspire. Because Roman society loved only the self, Roman society loved nothing, and it aspired to nothing, and promoted this aspiration to its future generations. And the individual who best embodied this love of nothingness, in this case Augustine himself, was hailed as the great role model to others. Jupiter, then, is not punishing the wicked for transgressions, but simply out of a display of his own power and egotistical desires manifested through the display of his own power from Augustine's point of view. Jupiter does what Jupiter does because he has the power to do so. Moral guidance or the moral law factor not in Jupiter's activities. So too was this reality of domineering exploitation inculcated into the Roman Empire writ large, and modeling itself off Jupiter Invictus Rex Caelus. Jupiter, the unconquerable king of heaven. This love of self, Augustine charged, was the reason for the existence of the Roman pantheon in of itself. The civic religion of Rome, like its education system, promoted the love of self so individuals could win cringing flattery for their actions in light of the approval of the gods. The civic cults only furthered the promotion of self-flattery and egotism above any higher truths or moral rectitude. As Augustine subsequently mused, if truth or moral fortitude was the aim of Rome, as its defenders often claimed, then why was there not a single shrine to Plato? The Roman gods embodied immorality, corrupting the moral law written on humanity's hearts, and therefore sanctioning the wicked imitation of the false gods. As Augustine noted, the Roman pantheon promoted the free play of evil from among their own devotees. Roman culture had truly become the puppets of immoral gods. What was most disconcerting for Augustine was that he was formed and instructed to be one of those immoral puppets and joyfully and even willingly embrace that lifestyle for most of his early life prior to his famous conversion in Milan. One of the constant themes of Roman enculturation, beyond its brutality, was the celebration of death. The Homeric epics, Virgil's Aeneid, the stories of Jupiter smiting the immoral with thunderbolts, all the while he engaged in immoral actions himself, all divinize death and destruction in some manner, a celebration of humanity's self-destructive impulses. Perhaps the most instructive and tragic example of this praising of nothingness or death was the rape and suicide of Lucretia, which was one of the most important founding myths of the Roman people. Lucretia's prominent place in Rome's mythological consciousness is that it was her rape by one of Tarquin's sons and her subsequent suicide that awakened the slumbering peoples of Rome to overthrow the tyrannical monarchy and inaugurate the supposed liberty and prosperity of the Republic. Thus Lucretia was held up as a virtuous heroine in Rome's founding mythology, which continued that process of inculcating particular self-loves for the people. Augustine began his commentary leading up to Lucretia's suicide as one on suicide more broadly. Therein he concluded that suicide is not a viable option in dealing with the trauma and absurdities of life. Indeed, those who have read even Albert Camus and Friedrich Nietzsche will paradoxically and ironically see the influence of Augustine on their own philosophies of life and suicide. Suicide was the result of fear of punishment, shame, or guilt, which only becomes magnified by institutions and others in perpetuating that fear of punishment, shame, or guilt. Leading to Lucretia's suicide, Augustine was perplexed by the contradictory dilemma in which Lucretia found herself. Was she chaste, or had she committed adultery? As he poignantly asked, if she is adulterous, why is she praised? If chaste, why was she put to death? For Augustine, the rape and suicide of Lucretia highlighted the moral depravity of Roman society and its institution, and what it aimed for. Lucretia, from Augustine's point of view, had done nothing wrong, and yet, as a result of the predatory advances of a powerful prince, she ultimately decided to take her life, with the Romans who lionized her, cheering her death every step of the way. As Augustine concluded, it was the feeling of shame from defilement fostered by the body of Roman society which caused her to commit suicide. Her blood was as much on the hands of the Romans as it was on Tarquin and his son. Shame, the product of Roman culture, killed her, not Tarquin's predatory son. Far from embodying puritanical Roman virtue, it was the burden of shame for now being unable to live up to the Roman ideal of purity which pushed her to her death. This is because, as Augustine tragically noted, Roman society had inculcated into her a drive of self-praise, pride, and honor that was now ripped away from her because of another's foul deed committed on her, even though not with her, and as a Roman woman excessively eager for honor, she was afraid that she should be thought, if she lived, to have willingly endured what, when she lived, she had violently suffered. Lucretia was held up by the Romans as a paragon of virtue only because she killed herself, as Augustine muses, for having felt conscious guilt and shame. That guilt Lucretia felt was the coercive guilt of Roman society's self-love, pride, and purity that came with self-love and pride, which Lucretia had lost in her affliction. As St. Thomas Aquinas later noted, in a hopeless society, people die to avoid shame. To avoid the shame of having lost her purity, Lucretia chose death because she had no hope. Had she not killed herself, Augustine's reflection implies, she would have been mocked and scorned by the same Romans who eventually celebrated her, only because she killed herself rather than live with the shame of having been raped. The irony of the story is that it encapsulated the Roman infatuation with power and death, and through the propaganda machinery of Roman education and embodied ethos, subsequently turned it into one of virtue and sacrifice. Lucretia had become the sacred outcast, though through no fault of her own, and paid the ultimate price for her defilement at the hands of another. She was innocent of the crimes which had caused her to choose death over life, but, moreover, she was a victim of social sin and structural pressure which had forced unto her that love of self and nothingness. When that love of self was stripped from her, having become objectified by Tarquin's son, who advanced on her for his own self-gratification, Lucretia had nothing left to live for, and so thrust the sword into her heart, with Roman society cheering her every step of the way. In Lucretia's story, we see the most poignant reflection of Augustine's understanding of the libido dominandi, the turning of a subject person into an object of predatory control. Augustine's reading of the rape of Lucretia is a damning indictment against social sin, structural power, and egotistical culture, which culminated in the tragedy of Lucretia's rape and suicide. What is made all the more egregious is how blind the Romans were to this reality, cloaking everything Augustine saw through with the celebratory veil of virtue, only because it was not they who had suffered and died like Lucretia. In other words, better her than them. In Lucretia's story, one sees that coercive domination hard at work through social forces as much as through institutional and systemic forces. It was only through Lucretia's death that she won the self-honor and self-praise Roman society aimed for, but as an objectified thing. The pressures of Roman society, that self-love inculcated through Roman virtues and social systems, pushed Lucretia out of society, not from her own doing, but by the foul deeds of another upon her, as Augustine so poignantly noted. In Lucretia's story, the ultimate self-reduction of the city of man based on the love of self, and only the love of self, is manifested. Everyone becomes an object to be objectified in the sight of the beholder, he who has predatory control and the lust to dominate. Augustine openly acknowledges that this is what happened to him. In seeking love and happiness, he sought after something to love. Therefore, it was only natural that he sought after things to satiate his desires. And so it was that Lucretia had become an object for Tarquin's son and an object extolled by the Romans after her death. Never was Lucretia a subject, a human being in the world. Never once was there a trace of seeing other humans as images of God made in love for love. The love of self reduces itself to either objectifier, becoming an agent of coercive objectification, or objectified, becoming the passive object of objectification. Augustine saw the tragic irony of the fate of Lucretia. It was only in her objectification and subsequent death that she won the praises of the city of man, which is the ultimate self-reducing end of the love of self to the point of contempt of God. That love of self, inculcated and writ large, can only win praise by arriving at self-love's final end, death. Roman heroes, in Augustine's critique and reading, were only remembered for how they died or conquered others, never in how they loved and served others. Lucretia wasn't remembered for the purity of her life before her rape. She was remembered for what she did after her rape, her supposedly noble suicide, which is what the Romans extolled and praised her for. Likewise, Augustine doesn't spare the other great founding myth of Rome, the story of Romulus and Remus. Augustine immediately recognized that the founding of Rome, like the founding of earthly cities in the Genesis account, stemmed from the sin of fratricide. The murder of Remus by his brother Romulus was because of the lust for domination that characterizes the city of man. Both sought the glory of Rome's founding for themselves. This want for self-glory and self-honor led to the lust for domination becoming a competition between the two, which ended in murder. For this is how Rome was founded, when Remus, as Roman history witnesses, was slain by his brother Romulus. The difference from the primal crime was that both brothers were citizens of the earthly city. Both sought glory of establishing the Roman state, but a joint foundation would not bring to each the glory that a single brother would enjoy. As Augustine also poignantly noted, The founding myth of Rome is not only one covered in the blood of fratricide, but also internal division, and filial division at that. For the city of man cannot be united, since love of self cannot bind people together. As Augustine says, thus the quarrel that arose between Remus and Romulus demonstrated the division of the earthly city against itself. One can see in Augustine's critique of the city of man that the city of man became what the human heart ironically desired: domination. The very machinery and institutional apparatus of the city subsequently embodied that ethos and inculcated it into society through its many systems. The political was entirely organized on the principle of love of self, leading to its debasement and self-destruction. Augustine's city of man, rooted in the love of self, is the worst aspects of what we might call a vile state, a base state, a despotic state wrapped all together in one aimless, coercive, and domineering city or society. Augustine's reading of self-love in the city of man is that it must necessarily exhaust itself in the pursuit of power, and it cannot be satiated until dominion is established over everything in the world. Thus you get Rome, mistress of the world. After all, the founding myths of Rome, Romulus and Remus, Aeneas and Lucretia, all involve death and domination. And that other great story of Rome, the murder of Julius Caesar in the name of saving the Republic, was yet another repeat of the only thing Rome knew, that blood must be spilled for praise, honor, and liberty to be won. The city of man, then, truly is the city which aims at domination to try and satisfy the self. The love of self necessarily leads to a dissolved and dissipated body, itself a corrupted parody of the original condition of harmony, integrity, and mutual self-respect founded on common love, i.e. God. That common love which binds together rather than separate and divide is a love that is wholehearted and harmonious obedience of mutual affection. And so it is in love that Augustine's criticism of Cicero is most properly brought to light. Cicero and Augustine both agree that a republic is based on the common good, but Augustine understood that common good is an extension of common love. For the good is tied to love itself, and especially the love of others. Without a common love to guide, all there is division and the reduction of life to tyranny, as Rome's history testified. Cicero called the republic a republic only insofar that a populace was united in a common sense of right and wrong. Cicero even acknowledged the importance of morality in the foundation of the republic, and that without that morality, the morality ceased to exist in all but name. Yet Augustine was perplexed as to whether this republic of Cicero's imagination ever existed at all. Cicero may have been a light in the darkness, but he was otherwise blind to the fact that the political apparatus of Rome promoted the very opposite of what he claimed the republic embodied. Only from that common sense of right and wrong could justice be dispensed, but Augustine bleakly asserted such a republic never existed, even when using Cicero's own definition. For unjust human institutions are not to be called or supposed to be institutions of right, for even they themselves say that right is what has flowed from the fount of justice. As for the notion of justice, commonly put forward by some misguided thinkers, that it is the interest of the strongest, quoting Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic there, they hold this to be the false conception. Therefore, where there is no true justice, there can be no association of men united in a common sense of right and wrong, and therefore no people answering to the definition of Scipio or Cicero. Because Rome was organized on self-love, rather than a common love which consummated in recognition of subjects of love, it could never possess that shared community of right and wrong which comes only from love of God. Everyone would love their own vision of the good and seek to manifest it. Justice was therefore always centered on the self for the end of self-gain, resulting in republics and kingdoms devolving into, quote, criminal gangs. There was no healing and no unitive dispensation of justice in Cicero's time, before Cicero's time, or after Cicero's time, precisely because the republic he so courageously defended was premised on the love of self reaching to the point of contempt of God. Cicero's republic was centered on self-love and self-praise. Its own sense of right and wrong was relativized, and the justice for which the republic stood for incomplete and equally relativized. Because of the nature of relativism with regard to the justice of the Roman Republic, which benefited those in power for self-aggrandizing ends, there was never a unity of right and wrong. Augustine's criticism of Cicero within the City of God is mostly a critique of Cicero not seeing that the Roman Republic was an immoral entity predicated on domination and slavery. It was therefore, quote, useless for Cicero to cry out against immorality, because the very republic he was eulogizing was a republic founded on the very immorality he was excoriating. Part of the reason for the city of man's descent into self-exhausting destruction is because it lives by the standard of falsity rather than truth. Since God is truth itself, and that is, by the way, Christian theological doctrine. You could read, say, the Catechism of the Catholic Church or any of the Christian theologians, Anselm's on truth, or even the epistles of St. John. God is truth itself. Since God is truth itself, the city of man, in rejecting God, necessarily rejects truth. Without truth, there can be nothing to keep the city of man united. This is what Cicero ultimately failed to realize. If Cicero had stumbled upon the truth, as Augustine seemingly implies, then only Cicero had come to know the truth and not the rest of the Roman Republic. Cicero, ironically, spoke only to himself, befitting of the fact that he was a Roman, and befitting of the reality of Rome's promotion of love of self. Rome, as the embodiment of the city of man, was built on the politics of lust and domination, which is what the city of man is defined by. That city had no hope, as brutally and poignantly revealed in Lucretia's rape and suicide, Romulus's murder of Remus, and the murder of Julius Caesar. The politics of lust leading to domination is what drives the city of man to its extirpation. As Augustine then goes on to show, Rome's greatness, its rise to greatness, was predicated on its lust to control the world, not any virtue inside of humans, as its apologists claimed. The haunting words of Virgil remind us, as Augustine showed us, this reality. Then came the Latin race, the lords of Alba, and the high mighty walls of Rome. Janus unda Latinum, Albanaque patres ataque alta Moenia Roma. If the city of man leads to coercion and the lust for domination, what does the city of God embody moreover than just the love of God to the point of the contempt of self? Augustine's great definition of the Trinity was that it was a relations of love, and that if one saw and embodied love, one saw and embodied the Trinity. By embodying the Trinity in and through love, the consequence of Augustine's thought is that the love of God is most purely manifested through the love of one's neighbor, which is, of course, what Christ taught in the Gospels. As Augustine recounted, how could the city embodying the honorable love of friends have started if the life of the saints were not social? Augustine here is employing rhetorical questions. Augustine's city of God is not one of retreat from the many ills, wrongs, enmities, wars, and other undoubted evils that exist, but of direct engagement with the world. Love requires engagement rather than retreat. Augustine's political theology necessarily leads to a social life preoccupied with loving service, seeking justice, and the dispensation of that justice to individuals and parties that have been wronged by grievous ills and criminal trials which plague the city of man. The love of others, of which the city of God is founded on, is not a call to separation, but a call to the shepherding and transformation of the earthly city to imitate the heavenly reality crying out to it. It is, in Reinhard Niebuhr's words, the call of moral man into immoral society, and not the call of moral man to withdraw entirely from immoral society. In this manner, Augustine, like Aristotle or Cicero before him, tacitly critiques the Cynic and Epicurean traditions, which called for societal withdrawal. What use is love and the virtues that come from love if one withdraws back into nothingness? This retreat is in some ways analogous to the denial of the Christian to pick up their cross and imitate Christ. Just as the city of man embodied, reflected, and forcefully promoted the love of self, the city of God exists in dialectical opposition to that city run by criminal gangs and criminal trials. The city of God embodies, reflects, and compassionately promotes, through imitation, the love of God through the social lives of the saints, which we are all called to embody, since the lives of the saints was simply the humanized imitation of Christ. The city of God is Imitatio Christi writ large. The heavenly city, as Augustine says, serves one another in love. After all, Christ's command to the disciples was to baptize the nations and not atomized and solitary individuals. The city of God is social, and its love is social. The city of God is itself the embodiment of Christ's teaching that love of God and love of neighbor is the whole of the law. The love of God leads to the love of neighbor, which has social implications and ramifications for life in the earthly city. The search for love and justice in the harsh cities founded by the sons of Cain pivots to one's family, but it does not remain situated with the family. This love eventually spreads outward to others. It is fair then to assess that Augustine's city is founded not on the family per se, but on love and justice, in which the family plays an integral role in fostering an ethos of love and justice, by which that experience of love and justice leads to a service of love and justice to others. For without love, there can be no family, so love comes first, from which all else flows. In the city of man, lust comes first, from which all else disintegrates. Augustine stands apart from Aristotle and Cicero, who both identify the family as the cornerstone of civilization. Augustine's theology reveals something deeper than the family: love itself. Love is what gives birth to the family, and where love is first nurtured. Love precedes the family, and therefore love is the first cornerstone of civilization. Thus we can see how a republic cannot come into being without a common love first. And also, for those familiar with Christian theology, you will see how it is the love of the Trinity which brings forth creation. Christian creation is not merely creatio ex nihilo, as Augustine and the other church fathers also write. It is creatio ex amor Dei, creation out of the love of God, which brings forth the creation of the material world from its inexistent nothingness. And thus again we see how once stripped of love and grace you reach nothing. The love of others come out succinctly in Augustine's recounting of the sack of Rome, when Christians within the city sheltered pagan Romans in their hour of need. The sacred places of the martyrs and the basilicas of the apostles bear witness to this, for in the sack of Rome they afforded shelter to fugitives, both Christian and pagan. In fleeing from the bloodlust and the rampage of the Visigoths, Romans who had scoffed and jeered at Christians suddenly found themselves being aided by those whom they ridiculed because of the love of others exhibited by Christians in Rome. The demand of the city of God, then, is the call to self-emptying. The love of God, to the point of contempt of the self, is really the embodiment of self-emptying for others, which is the opposite of self-use, which defines the lust to dominate. This was revealed most emphatically during the sack of Rome. During this tumultuous moment, Christians did not discriminate against those whom they would shelter from the horrors of the slaughter outside the walls of their sanctuaries, but truly embodied that ethos of self-emptying love, even to those whom they knew despised them at every level of their being. We can conclude that Augustine is the strongest critic of social sin of the patristic period, and remains one of the greatest critics of immoral society and what it does to individuals. Far from a bleak pessimist, Augustine's political theology offers a glimpse of the city of love through the love of others, which is what constitutes the pulsating heart of the city of God. The city of God is not merely a distant city to arrive after death. It is the city to which those who exhibit the love of others rather than the love of self belong in temporal life. The city will transit or make passage into the heavenly city, but its roots in this world, it has roots in this world passing into the next. The city of love and the relations of love in this world, the love exuded in this life, prefigure the city of love to come, which St. Paul says is the true hope of Christians and the only hope for the world. For this city of love and peace, which Augustine argues is the destination of the Christian, is also the city which Homer and Virgil longed for, with all their imperfections. In the first half of the City of God, Augustine systematically laid bare the empty ideology of the city of man and the Roman Imperium in a breathtaking counter-narrative that remains prescient, which remains prescient for moderns and remains relevant for today. Those blinded by their own imaginary Rome, like Cicero, failed to see the darkness that so governed the so-called eternal city, challenging that other eternal city which Christians are pilgrimaging toward. But this is pitiable from Augustine's perspective. It is indeed tragic, and we see here Augustine the tragedian and Augustine the ironist, as much as we see Augustine the theologian. For in their blindness, Augustine extends his hand of mercy and love to his critics. He extends his loving hand to those lost in the sea of domination by ironically referencing Virgil and directing them to the true city that will satiate their desires. Now take possession of the heavenly country, for which you will have to endure but little hardship, and you will reign there in truth and love, forever and ever.